like to thank the Center for the Humanities for sponsoring this talk, as well as Books and Books. And the title of my book is Waves of Decolonization, Discourses of Race and Hemispheric Citizenship in Cuba, Mexico, and the United States. And I'd like to start with two quotations by W.B. Du Bois, who was one of the founders of the NAACP, was a participant in the Niagara movement that led to the formation of the NAACP. He was a scholar, an activist for many years, and was an unrelenting critic of the U.S. empire. So I'd like to begin with his work. And the reason why I'm beginning with him is I think his work has been read within a national frame because his Souls of Black Folk somewhat fits within the United States, within United States history. But what I want to show is that you can read Souls of Black Folk as pushing outward into a more thorough engagement with the shadow of the U.S. empire. So the first quote is, actually I'll read them in opposite order of their, not in chronological order. I'll begin with the quote from the Souls of Black Folk. That's the famous quote that everyone knows. The problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line, the relation of the darker to the lighter races of men in Asia and Africa, in America, and the islands of the sea. In that quote, what I'd like to point your attention to is that the first phrase is very well known, but the second phrase often gets left out. So if you cut out the second part of it, it's easy to force Du Bois into a U.S. national frame. But if you include the second part, you can see that he's very engaged with international issues. And the earlier speech, called The Present Outlook for the Dark Races of Mankind, the first one there, he used this speech to kind of develop his ideas that that kind of funneled into the Souls of Black Folk. So I'll read that now. The colored population of our land is, through the new imperial policy, about to be doubled by our own ownership of Puerto Rico and Hawaii, our protectorate of Cuba, and the conquest of the Philippines. This is for us and for the nation the greatest event since the Civil War. What is to be our attitude toward the new lands and toward the masses of dark men and women who inhabit them? Manifestly, it must be an attitude of deepest sympathy and strongest alliance. Now, in that speech, he also emphasizes the world aspect of the color line in time and space. So what interests me here is both his deep engagement with the Americas as a historical formation and with the long shadow cast by U.S. imperialism, but also his idea in germination of the color line, which he first formulated in this 1900 speech. How does the world aspect of the color line in time and space kind of serve as a framework for my own work? Well, in terms of time, the conceptual paradigm of the color line forces us to move beyond conventional historical periods and to recognize that racial problems persist across large historical periods. When you transition from one historical period to another, you don't get the resolution of racial problems. That's one thing that he points to. And then another thing, in terms of space, the color line traces and traverses national boundaries. So in this book, I map the Du Boisian color line onto what he calls the new imperial policy of the United States, preceding and following the Spanish-American War of 1898. My topic is to examine how writer-activists in Cuba, Mexico, and the United States defined their local struggles in relation to broader hemispheric movements against imperialism and racial oppression, and thus to varying degrees promoted or rejected decolonization. Now, decolonization, I define decolonization as the project of assailing the anti-democratic policies of the U.S. imperialism along the global color line and developing new and more egalitarian societies. Now, when most people think about decolonization, they think of struggles in Asia and Africa in the 1950s and 60s. But if you look into the history of the Americas, you find that there's an earlier chronology of independence and thus decolonization in the Americas. Latin America, most of Latin America gained its independence in the 1820s. And so there's a long durée of decolonization in the Americas that precedes decolonization in Africa and Asia. And one writer who developed ideas of decolonization in Latin America is Jose Marti, the great Cuban patriot and independence leader. And he developed thumbnail definitions of decolonization that are good to use. For instance, he argued that we need to get Spain out of our habits. That's one thumbnail definition of decolonization. Another is that he feared that the colony in Latin America would continue to live in the Republic. And so he argued vehemently to try to struggle against that. And then Manuel Gamio, the Mexican anthropologist and a traveler to the United States who worked with the Chicago School of Sociology, he argued that the Mexican Revolution must be accompanied by a mental revolution. So I use the phrase waves of decolonization to introduce a novel periodization of history, a periodization that traverses national boundaries as well. There are 4 decisive wars that shape the waves of decolonization that I examine in this book. The first is the Mexican-American War of 1846 to 1848, in which the United States annexed half of Mexico. The second is the War for Cuban Independence from 1895 to 1898, and the ensuing Spanish-American-Cuban War of 1898, both of which ironically paved the way for U.S. neocolonialism under the terms of the Platt Amendment to the Cuban Constitution in 1903. This was an amendment that gave us the Guantanamo base in Cuba and wrote into Cuban law, the founding document of the Cuban Republic, that the United States had the right to intervene militarily at any time in Cuban affairs. The third would be the Mexican Revolution of 1910 to 1917, and the fourth is World War I, which is 1914 to 1918. Now, the cultural context of each wave of decolonization emerges in differing combinations of literary and social scientific discourses that cross national boundaries, including sentimentalism, primitivism, and ethnography. Sentimentalism focuses on sympathetic responses to the plight of oppressed groups in order to create moral resolutions of collective dilemmas. Primitivist discourses create an opposition between the so-called primitive peoples and the civilized or modern peoples, and usually finding fault with one or the other. And ethnography is writing about culture after an experience of participant observation. Now, although scholars typically associate all of these discourses with racial hierarchies, what I'm interested in is in how they cross national boundaries and therefore lend themselves to imaginings of interethnic and transnational alliance as well. So there are 2 related problems of citizenship in countries subjected to imperialism that led me to formulate my idea of discourses and practices of hemispheric citizenship. Now, the first problem is that there is a gray zone of citizenship in which U.S. imperialism expands the sovereignty of the United States and calls the shots in other countries to varying degrees, depriving the residents of rights. This is especially the case under conditions of neocolonialism, which prevailed in Cuba in its so-called Republican period. In Cuba, the United States set up a series of puppet governments in the early 20th century, and as I said before, intervened militarily several times and violated Cuban sovereignty. And so, since the United States usurped the ruling order in Cuba, the residents had no recourse through the traditional avenues of citizenship. And so therefore, with Hannah Arendt, I'd argue that the residents of neocolonized countries are rendered half stateless and sometimes rightless as well. And so that brings us to the second problem, which is that if processes of citizenship are traditionally considered to take place within a given nation-state, what happens to them when an imperial state has usurped another country's sovereignty? So in the context of geographically stretched out relations, social relations under neocolonialism, citizenship acquires new meanings. Other scholars have theorized different modes of citizenship, such as transnational citizenship or cultural citizenship. I build on this scholarship by positing discourses and practices of hemispheric citizenship, or efforts to turn critical perspectives on U.S. imperialism in Latin America to the advantage of the oppressed in both regions. And some examples of hemispheric citizenship that I discuss in the book are the protests of the U.S. occupation of Haiti from 1915 to 1934,